Hello everybody and welcome back to another installment from our series Straight from the Horse's Mouth. Today's webinar centers around what a circular supply chain looks like and more importantly, how it can be implemented. Here's a sneak preview.
Again, the first principle of a circular economy is to use less, design waste out. So we've got to stop shipping all these items all the way around the world. And to me, circularity is just an extension. So if lean is all about finding and eliminating waste, which we do first, then circularity is the next step of finding and monetizing waste. And they're very close cousins in this discussion. You know, visibility in supply chains have been a hot topic for a while now. And data sharing has been difficult, I think, because we've wanted to data share for data sharing. Recommending a periodic table of uses instead of a periodic table of elements. I'd say the one KPI to focus on would be to understand what's coming into your supply chain and where it's coming from.
Deborah is the perfect guest for this webinar as her enthusiasm has allowed her to draw supply chain experience from digital product development, mature and frontier markets, international development, and etc. With that, let's get started.
Hello and welcome back to our webinar series, Straight from the Horse's Mouth, Insights from Experts in 30 Minutes. My name is Jim Goddin. I'm the Technical Director for Circular Economy at thinkstep-anz, and I'm your host for the next half an hour. Today we'll focus on the role of supply chains in delivering the circular economy. Today our guest speaker is Deborah Dull. Deborah and I know each other through the Ellen MacArthur Foundation's C100 acceleration workshops, and I had the great pleasure of meeting her at one of these events in Oregon early in 2019, which seems a long time ago now. Deborah is a supply chain enthusiast who draws a supply chain experience from digital product development, consumer goods, global retail, and mature and frontier markets and international development. Her passion for global supply chains has taken her to over 40 countries. And as the founder of the Circular Supply Chain Network, she connects a wide range of network of supply chain professionals who learn and take action towards a circular economy. With that, let's get started, and it's over to you, Deborah.
Perfect. Thank you. Thanks for having me today, and thank you for the curiosity to learn more about circular supply chains. I discovered circularity, almost 4 years ago, and given that I am a supply chain practitioner, I immediately started wondering, what does this mean for my field? And I think the impacts of circularity on supply chain are far-reaching, and I think the requirements of supply chain to enable a transition to a circular economy are also pretty broad. In our time we have together today, let's explore circular supply chains. First, what does supply chain have to do with circularity? Second, what does a circular supply chain look like? And last, how can you get started? So hopefully you can leave today with a few actionable ideas. First, we're going to go through a bit of a Venn diagram. I've recently pulled this together as I've spent more time thinking about why does it seem like supply chains constantly left out of the conversation in the land of circularity. Sometimes I see the word circular supply chain and really they're meaning circular materials. So this is my take. Welcome the discussion and dialogue, and then we'll hop into what does a circular supply chain look like and how to get started. The first component, of course, of circular economy, which, spoiler alert, will be the little bit in the middle, that's what we're going to call the circular economy. The first part is business models of circularity. So of course we hear all about the transition from selling products to selling services. This works for some businesses. It doesn't work for all businesses. We start seeing new business models around reusable packaging, quite interesting space palettes, certainly across the supply chain, especially from our friends over at CHEP. So we can have business models. We're all familiar with those. I think that's the majority of examples out in the world. We can have materials that are circular. This often looks a bit like recycling, unless we're able to leave the items as themselves for as long as possible, which we know is the goal in circularity. So we can take a modular product or refurbish an item, and it adds even more value to the economy. So we can have circular materials. The third major building block here are circular operations. This is really when we think about all the inputs that go in along the way that maybe isn't the actual final good material. This could be air, this could be water, this could be electric, this could be lubricants for machines, this could be packaging, which we've covered. But anything that goes into the process as you're going along and creating whatever item or service it is. So if those are the major three building blocks, what are some of the challenges? And then we can talk about overcoming these together. First, where business models and materials meet, I think those are markets. And right now, the number one most challenging element of entering a circular economy that I'm told, I speak with chief supply chain officers and their teams around the world, and they say, I get it, I need to go find secondary materials. How do I do that exactly? Where are they? Often they're more expensive. We have a lot of market failures still, which is preventing our transition to a circular economy. So we're well familiar with all of these, I'm sure. Where business models and operations come together, I think we call those circular strategies. So how do we develop a comparative advantage for our organizations? Regardless if your goal is profit or your goal is something else, you need a comparative advantage to justify your existence. And we see a lot of conflict here in the transition from linear, more traditional incentive models, the ways that we can compete. We see some challenges in trying to unstick that. Sometimes we call it first mover disadvantage is what we're faced with here. And then of course we come to circular supply chains. So I think where operations and materials come together, we get circular supply chains, and that's what we're going to focus our time on today. I'll talk in depth about this for the rest of our time together. So we'll hear more about the different elements here. And of course, when they all come together, we are in a circular economy. This is my version of it. I'm open to a discussion debate on what you think the different elements might be. But let's really look into circular supply chains. So what's the definition of a circular supply chain? And here at the Circular Supply Chain Network, we're a group of volunteers, and we get together across the community. Recently, we've sat down and realized we've never actually defined a circular supply chain, which is fairly embarrassing, but we've done it. And so I'll walk you through our definition now, and then go into a couple of characteristics, and then again, how to get started. So we're going to break this down and take it one at a time. Supply chains in the end are just basically a series of inputs, outputs, and processes. We put all those together and that makes the chain. Some people call it a network or a web, but the basics are still there. There's inputs, outputs, and processes. So we're going to start with circular supply chains are interconnected systems. So this is the first difference between a linear supply chain to a circular supply chain, as we assume they have to be interconnected. Otherwise, it doesn't work like an ecosystem. So to get that market and the exchange, the circulation piece, we have to be actually connected to other operations. Key part here, they use secondary and regenerative inputs only. Today, as we know, the world is 8.6% circular, which tells us that the vast majority of inputs into our supply chains, which equal 100 billion tons of materials a year, they are, for the majority of that, 92.5 billion tons, are linear, virgin, first time use, primary materials coming out of the planet. And so a circular supply chain shifts and uses secondary and regenerative inputs to generate value. This is a very subtle and succinct way of saying there is no waste produced by a circular supply chain. The idea, of course, is every operation becomes a source of raw materials for another operation. And so anything that today you're paying to dispose of course, that shifts to be sold tomorrow. Industrial waste in America is a $57 billion a year industry, and we predict that will grow aggressively in the next 10 years. And lastly, how we do this is the process piece. We have inputs, we have outputs, and we've got process. And this is by reducing and extending resource use. That first principle of the circular economy of using less is highlighted here. If we reduce the amount we need and we extend the life of our items, we can reduce the pull on the planet even more. So we think this is a pretty okay starting point for our definition. Coming down after this, we're going to have a one-pager short presentation, little explainer video, and I'm really excited. We're going to have a kids book because we've recently been informed that the brain of a CEO and the brain of a 6-year-old are very similar in that they need short, simple sentences and a lot of graphics. So we're going to challenge ourselves as a community, as a network, to explain a circular supply chain in a kid's book. So I'm excited about that. Let's go through 5 characteristics of a circular supply chain so we can start to get our head around what these might look like. So first, a circular supply chain is lean, as in lean management. This one should feel familiar to us. This was a big deal, 80s, 90s, early 2000s. As the land of digital transformation has come in, some parts of our operations we've forgotten lean. A lot of it relies on visual cues and no tech, but we're starting to better understand how to combine technology and the methodologies of lean, the intent behind the lean tools. And to me, circularity is just an extension. So if lean is all about finding and eliminating waste, which we do first, then circularity is the next step of finding and monetizing waste. And they're very close cousins in this discussion. The second is a circular supply chain is visible. So after we lean it out, we need to make sure that, again, waste from one operation can input to another operation. We used to say that data is the new oil. I disagree with that. I actually think that data is table stakes for us to interact in this new economy that we call the circular economy. Circular supply chains are predictive. So again, if we think about today, we have value streams and we have waste streams. I think tomorrow we'll have something called maybe a primary value stream and a secondary value stream, something like this. And we'll need to be able to know a lot about those two types of customers. The customer that buys our primary value are finished goods today, and those that buy our secondary value are waste today, and start to be able to be predictive so that they can plan their operations as well. Quite a shift for us, but it's certainly possible. 4 of 5 here, a circular supply chain is regional. If we think about, again, the first principle of a circular economy is to use less, design waste out. So we've got to stop shipping all these items all the way around the world. One example I like to use is these little pear cups we put in kids' lunch boxes. Today in America, we have these pear containers that are grown in Argentina, packaged in Asia, sent to America 18,000 miles later, when in fact, we grow pears in America. Where I grew up, we grow quite a few pears, and we have the ability to make package happen. So we have to think about changing our paradigms in the way we think about this to harvest, transform, and use materials regionally instead. The last one here is that circular supply chains are flexible. So if we think about that material section of circularity, what's coming in is going to be different. And I'll talk about this a little bit more, but the idea essentially is if we start to substitute materials that come from the planet today, there's a school of thought around biomaterials that we can start creating materials with biology instead. And again, I'll talk about that a little bit more. But here comes our 5 characteristics of a circular supply chain. I'll run through an example of each one very quickly, and we'll get into the last section and then into your questions. So this first idea, when we think about leaning out, the vast majority of operations that I speak with are focused on water and electric, and we're seeing more and more digital tools to help folks transition. Next, when we think about making your operations visible, there's a very interesting company out of Berlin called Plan A. I recommend checking them out. They have a very unique way of looking at companies' emissions. Our friends over at Noodle AI, it's again a digital tool used to imagine a world without waste is their tagline. Very interesting, a different way of managing our supply chains and worth a look. We're starting to see new types of technologies that suggest that we can be processing our waste in different ways. So it's not quite recycling. We can take mixed garbage, process it, and with limited to no emissions come out with like virgin commodities that we can then use again. So the breakthroughs in allowing regional capture and reuse of materials are quite impressive. And again, with flexibility comes the ability to do additive manufacturing. I saw it as an upcoming topic for you all to look at in a few weeks. In this case, this is an example from BMW, but quite interesting. So that was a very, very quick look at what a circular supply chain can look like, but let's look at how to actually get started, how you can transition from a linear to a circular operation. We think that there's 7 steps. Are these right? Maybe. As you go through these, feedback to us and let us know if there's 6 or 5 or 12 and how realistic, how useful each one of these steps are. So we'll go through these pretty rapidly here. The first one, of course, is to identify what are the ways that we can transition what is today waste into value. I like this quote from Bill McDonough. He calls it fugitive value. It's not where it's meant to be. Sometimes we don't always look at where we should. So if we think about something like a receiving dock, and we can imagine the packaging that runs around our supply chains often aren't captured in our own value stream map. So it's a good place to start. Technology can assist us here. If you already have some digital process maps, it can be a really useful way to start. Way to measure this is to look at an in-out ratio. The concept of mass balance is starting to be used to start describing what's going in and out of every different process step. If we extend this to include, water, electric, we start to get some pretty interesting measurements. The next one is called intensify. This is all about driving up use of the items in our supply chain. Of course, for a business model perspective, we can start to change as product as a service. We can also redesign the product, and a lot of engineers around the world, designers are looking at that. But here in supply chain, of course, we own the process. And so we start to imagine, what could my process look like if I took out large areas of the process? What if I didn't have to ship this around the world? What if we didn't have to hit minimum manufacturing quantities? What if our lot sizes became lower? Could we drive up the utilization of all of the elements in our supply chain, which then, of course, based on the circular economy, says we will make more money? We want to use everything to 100%. Maybe it's possible, maybe it's not, but it's an aspirational directional measure. That's the direction to go in. After we identify and intensify, then we're going to narrow. And again, this should feel quite familiar to us as we think about leaning out our supply chains. One quite unique way we can do this as well is to actually put manufacturing closer to the point of use. The good folks over at Unilever have been attempting to pull this off and have just recently announced nano manufacturing. They put an entire food manufacturing line in this 40-foot container, and they can plop it close to the point of use. And so now we don't have to have these assumptions of large mega factories around the world that requires lots of shipping, where worldwide logistics contributes 15% of the world's emissions, and we can start to cut that out. Not to be outdone, the folks over at Microsoft have also put a server in a box, which I think is quite an interesting way to start thinking about offline server farms that can be placed closer to point of use. With narrow, we of course want to go to 100% waste reduction. We could say, zero waste, but we're trying to make all the targets 100%. So that's how we measure this. Then we get into predictions. So as we all know, we're well in our way to the middle of Industry 4.0, and we're starting to have the tools to have a connected and smart infrastructure and processes. This allows us to help to correct some of the market failures we talked about with the materials markets. And one example of what's happening over at the excess materials exchange is this idea of recommending a periodic table of uses instead of a periodic table of elements. Like I'd mentioned before, we are on the cusp of a lot of innovative breakthroughs in material sciences. And if we could start to imagine, what if we didn't need gold specifically? What if needed the characteristics of gold, and we can have another material come in and fill its place? Quite an interesting place to watch, and pretty extensive impacts on our supply chains to look out for. This one's measured by forecast accuracy, but it's not forecasting like supply chain folks know. It feels a little bit different than that. But essentially, we need to understand what's happening in our supply chains. Then we get to slow. This one should feel familiar to us. This is extending the life of an asset as long as we can. This one comes from my day job at GE. I was at Microsoft before. And at GE, we sell engines as a service. And so there's 600 sensors inside each of these turbines, and we learn a lot about them and extend their use. However, you may use the internet as part of your job. The internet is a real physical place, and it pulls on the environment. It may just be good old-fashioned assets, classic assets, or that one really important forklift you have somewhere in your operation. Now, MRO, when we think about maintenance and repair, is not new in supply chains. However, this space will really become a lot larger in the next 10 years as we repair more than we make new. We have an idea that we can have each version last 100% longer than the version before. Is it possible? Certainly it's possible. Are there constraints to do that? Of course, and there's mismatched incentives, but that's for another webinar. Close, this is what should feel very familiar to us as the basis of the circular economy. This is an example from the folks over at BASF and their Verbund sites, which essentially is industrial symbiosis within their own operations. The team at Zymergen is starting to look again at biomaterials. It's estimated 60% of the materials entering the global economy every year could come from biology. So quite a booming space. The target for close, which is really that type of material, closed loop material operations, is to have everything coming from a secondary or regenerative source. Far cry from where we are today, but again, we've got to have a direction we're running in. The last one we get to, of course, is capture. This is something we look at specifically for supply chain. There seems to be this assumption that we can go to a secondary materials market and just find items that have been captured and cleaned up. we think that there's something akin to a secondary materials as a service floating around out here, which I think will be quite interesting. Now, of course, we've had something like scrap metal markets for years now, and this type of a market will really expand again in the years to come. This one is measured by capacity. Now, everything else started at 0 up to 100. This one is saying we're making a lot more than the world needs today. So we need to bring down our mining capacity, whether it's urban mining or however it is we're going to go and find materials out in the world and bring that down to only make what's needed. So as a very quick introduction and rundown, I want to switch to Q&A now, though, so we can have a bit of a conversation. So circular supply chains, I'll put the definition up one more time, and hopefully this is resonating with you. And Jim, over to you.
That's a fantastic introduction to supply chains. The first question I've got in from Kanika is, what kind of questions can you ask of your supply chain to get all of the information you require for step 1 in your diagram, which is to identify?
Yeah, really good question. You know, if we think about a traditional tool called a value stream map, something that's been used for a really long time in uni, I drew one with a ruler and a piece of paper, and we extend those types of ideas. So specific questions would be, what is coming into your operation? You can think supply chain, but bite off a chunk of it and maybe say a factory or one specific operation. What is every item that comes in? How much does it weigh? That includes water, lubricants, anything that comes in. Right now, actually, a lot of operations are considering PPE to be part of this. So special case, the PPE that's single use that their workers are using daily, that is now considered an input into the supply chain. So if we start measuring circularity, it needs to be a factor. So first we say what's coming in. Sometimes we actually don't know everything that's coming in, and that's okay. It can be really difficult to actually understand how much electric is used in a given operation unless you've got sensors placed strategically across your operation. So that's step 1. The next one is, of course, what's going out and where is it going to? How much is going to your customer of a finished good? How much is being disposed? How much is going down a drain? How much is going out of a pipe via steam? Everything has to go somewhere. Very likely you won't be able to find it all, so there's going to be some level of a gap. And that's the gap that you want to just understand. So step 1, don't worry about trying to, change all your processes all at the beginning, just starting to become curious about your process and understanding how do we close the in-out knowledge gap. And once you can do that, then of course you can start to take actions to actually change the way that your operation is set up.
But perhaps a follow-up question to the one you just answered. Before this call, we were talking about measurement and the opportunities for data systems. And you've mentioned metrics, how do you measure circular economy as part of that? Can you expand on that sort of opportunity? Where do things like transparency within supply chains sit? How are we likely to overcome some of those barriers to sharing data within supply chains as part of this transition?
Visibility in supply chains have been a hot topic for a while now, and data sharing has been difficult, I think, because we've wanted to data share for data sharing. But I think if we can consider visibility to be a level 2 measurement, meaning it supports some other higher level measurement, I think we can get more traction in data sharing. This last year, what we've seen is that sharing data across our supply chains, in fact, do not lead to worse performance. It actually gives us a better shot of meeting the changes in demand that we expect to come, but we never expected something like COVID to happen. What this has shown, however, is that it is possible to intentionally share focused data. And by doing that, then all parties can win. So there's this piece of why do we need to have that data and what's the outcome we're going to achieve with it. I find couched better, organizations are more willing to share. There's certainly also a cost to connecting to some sort of a visibility platform that can also be a barrier. I do think this is going to be a huge shift in these coming years. The analysts over at McKinsey give us till 2025 till supply chains can't produce waste. That's a tall order. That's only 3.5 years away. And the folks at Gartner say it's more like 2030. However many years it is, it's an inevitable shift. We have to change our relationship with materials, and the role of supply chain, I think, will be quite central to that transition.
Another question around the supply chain in terms of the companies that specialize in providing primary materials or in shipping primary materials. I mean, the model you're explaining is potentially very disruptive for those types of company. You know, if you're a primary material producer or you're involved in shipping and distribution, what is the future for companies like that? How should they seek to adapt, and how do we support them as businesses that have those type of companies in our supply chains?
The folks who are going to get really disrupted are those who are in mining, as of mining from the planet, but they're already feeling that. And there's actually quite a bit of research and development from those types of companies into other ways to find resources, again, like urban mining. There's this realm of people who, I may not have the name right, I call them a materials broker, somebody to sit between materials and whoever it is that who needs to buy them. We have commodities markets today, and I think those folks who sit in the middle can go and seek additional sources of inputs. We are facing dwindling inputs, and so there has to be a shift eventually. But I think there's plenty of additional spaces, jobs, market share, money to be made here. A lot of what we're looking at is sheer material security, risk to materials. And again, in this last year, I think we're all quite aware of just how fragile our global supply chains are. They're well-oiled machines when nothing changes. But if we start to squeeze the beginnings of our supply chains with material availability, we're going to start to see the widespread types of shortages like we did in this last year. So I think there's plenty of market share to go around, but all of us need to start shifting our concepts of where we get our materials from.
Can you give examples of introductory KPIs for circular transformation for businesses getting started? This is from Catherine.
I'd say the one KPI to focus on would be to understand what's coming into your supply chain and where it's coming from. Now, this is a bit of a trick answer because it's not necessarily introductory in nature. Given the length of our global supply chains these days, it's actually quite difficult to know your tier 2, 3, 5, 7, 9 suppliers. Once you get past 1 and 2, it gets a little murky of what's going on back there. But if you can get a handle on what's coming in from where, and from where I mean, is it primary or secondary, and just start there. It's going to be a tall book of work to go and do. I find many circular conversations are focused at end of life. I think that's actually ill-placed focus. We need to start looking at the beginning of our supply chains and understanding where those items are coming in from. So if you can give that a go, I think that's a good place to start. Again, it seems simple. We can explain it easily, but it will be quite difficult, I think, quite a challenge to go and answer that question.
But I'd like to thank you again, Deborah, for sharing your insight with us. It's been a fascinating session. I've got a whole pile of questions I want to answer, and I'll be following up with you afterwards. We are looking forward to seeing you next time, and I hope you have a great day. So thank you again, Deborah, and look forward to catching up with you soon.